Hello and welcome to the Ourdadsstamps YouTube channel, where we talk about all things related to stamps and stamp collecting. My name's Pete West and I'd like to thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, please click on the like button and don't forget to subscribe to get regular updates of new content.
Hello and welcome once again to Ourdadsstamps video. For today's episode I thought I would give some hints and tips on the plating of the penny black. Now, some of these hints and tips can also apply to the penny red as well, but this video is specifically aimed at plating the penny black, and it's by no means comprehensive, but it does give you some hints and tips and an idea of what to look out for. I have to say I wouldn't class myself as an expert at plating penny blacks, but I do have some experience and I have had some success, so I'll pass on what I know and hope it helps you in some way. The resources I use when I'm looking at penny blacks and trying to plate them is a couple of books and also some things I've got for the internet. So the first book I bought was the Stanley Gibbons Specialised Queen Victoria catalogue, and that has lots of hints and tips and brief descriptions of each of the plates, and is certainly a great help. The second book, which is much more helpful, has much more detail in it, but consequently is much more expensive, is The Plating of the Penny Black. The original book by Charles Nissen was printed in 1922 and is almost impossible to get hold of. But Stanley Gibbons did reprint the book and I bought one a few years ago. It cost me close to £100, but has been invaluable in helping me to plate the penny black. I wouldn't say it's essential if you want to plate penny blacks, but is certainly worthwhile, and if it's something you're serious about, then it's probably a good investment. After recording this video, I looked up some information about this book, and actually the Stanley Gibbons reprint is now very difficult to get hold of. I've seen it advertised for over £500. So whilst I stand by the fact that it's a very valuable resource, maybe that sort of price is beyond a lot of people. However, there are lots of resources available on the internet, and with a bit of searching you can generally find descriptions and even the reconstruction sheets, so I would suggest going down that route initially. The other things I use to help me are images of the registration sheets. These can be found on the internet, although it does take some searching, and I'll leave a couple of websites that are quite useful in the notes, so have a look. Before we look deeply into the different plates, just a quick word about how the penny black was printed. It was printed in sheets of 240 stamps. These were in 20 rows of 12, making 240 altogether, and each of these was reproduced by a process to make sure that all the stamps were identical on the sheet. However, as a security measure, in the bottom two corners check letters were printed, and these were stamped by hand, so there is variations in all of them, and this is the biggest clue as to which plate you've got. And once you've narrowed it down to one or two plates, this is the final check, if you like. The first thing to look out for is what's known as ray flaws. Now, in the top left and right corner of the penny black was a design that loosely resembled a sun with lines coming out of it, as known as rays. And there are four large sort of elliptical shapes going into each of the corner, and then in between each of these there's three lines making up 12 rays in total, and these can be labelled by referring to a clock face. So the line pointing straight up is the 12 o'clock ray, and the line pointing straight down is the 6 o'clock ray, and so on. Now, because these are quite fine, they were easily damaged over time, and several of them are completely missing. So it's one of the ways of being able to recognise which plate it's from is dependent on which rays are missing or which combination of rays are missing. For example, one of the characteristics of plate 1 is what's known as the 10 o'clock ray flaw, which is the line at 10 o'clock on the circle is missing. These are not always easy to see due to cancellation marks covering the corners of the stamp, but if it's visible, then it's one of the clues that you can look out for. They are also very, very small, so you will either need a very strong magnifying glass, or as I do, I scan the stamps in at a high resolution and then blow them up on the screen so I can have a closer look. But to the naked eye, it's very, very difficult to see these differences. Another one to look out for, which is possibly a bit more obvious, is what's called the O flaw. The O from the word 1 penny at the bottom developed a fault and appears as an extra line in the bottom right hand side. And this occurred on the first few rows of plate 7 and 8, and then all the stamps on plate 9 and 10. So again, if you find one with an extra mark on the O in the 1 penny, then it's likely to be from one of these plates. And again, when you're doing this, one particular characteristics won't definitely say it's that plate, but all the bits help to add to a story to get you in the right direction. Another thing which can be a clue is what are called guidelines. These are just thin lines on the stamp that were used to aid the printer in lining up where the sheet should go. And sometimes they show up as thin lines within the stamp, sometimes they show up as thin lines just outside the stamp. But again, the positioning or the existence of these as guidelines can help to identify which plate it comes from. And a final thing to look out for when you're looking at the stamp in general is the frame lines, the bits on the outside of the stamp, particularly on the two sides. Because these are on the outside, they're more exposed and therefore more susceptible to damage. And in some cases, again, especially in plate 4 and 5, on the left-hand side, these frame lines became damaged over time and show up as slightly incomplete or irregular. Once you've looked at all these points and got a rough idea of which maybe 2 or 3 plates it could be, then the final piece of the jigsaw is to actually look at the position of the letters, the check letters in the bottom corners. And this is where a copy of the registered sheets is invaluable. Because the letters were punched in by hand, almost all of them are in slightly different places. And just by looking, you can usually work out which one is which and which plate that combination of irregularities come from. There is a scientific way of doing this where measurements have been taken from various odd angles within the box, and that can be compared with the known plate numbers. But I must admit, I prefer doing it just by the look and just by the look of all the other characteristics of the plate. Here, the book, The Plating of the Penny Black, not only gives you a description of each and every letter for each and every plate number, but also gives you a picture of each and every letter from each and every plate number. So, as I've said previously, it's an invaluable resource if you want to make a good go at plating the penny black. As I've said, there are a couple of websites that gives you a fair bit of information, and certainly one worth having a look at is called the Plating Project, and I'll leave the link in the notes for this video. But that has images of almost all the penny blacks that you're likely to come across. They are listed by plate number and then by check letters from AA through to TL, And then once you find the stamp that you're interested in, you click on a link and you get an image of what that stamp looks like. And then you can study where the check letters are and any other peculiarities to that stamp to compare it to the one you've got. It's an excellent resource, but you do need to have some idea of which plate number your stamp is from. It's one of those that you need to have an idea of what you're looking for, and then you can check with what you've got. Unless, of course, you go through all 12 plate numbers and check that letter, which is quite possible, and certainly will then give you a good idea. If you prefer a scientific method, then on the Great Britain Philatelic Society's website, there are several pages devoted to the work of Mr. Fisher and Mr. Brown, who devised a system of measurements measuring the check letters, and from these measurements you can deduce which plate number your stamp is from. This applies to penny reds as well as penny blacks, so if you like the scientific approach, it may well be worth looking at. There's complete instructions on how to use it and a look at the gauge. I have to say it looks quite complicated and I prefer the visual method, but if you like the scientific approach, this may be for you. It's certainly worth a look to see whether you can get on with it anyway. So I will leave this website as well in the notes, and then you can choose which one you prefer. But both pages are free resources and are invaluable help when plating. Just a few tips and hints on the different plates. Plate 1, the first one, was not hardened before it was sent to press, and consequently it wore out very quickly. In fact, it was first registered on the 15th of April, but actually wore out before the penny black was issued, so they had to do extensive repairs, and consequently the amount of repairs changed it so much that it's now recognised as two different plates, which are labelled plate 1A and plate 1B. Both of these plates can be identified with the 10 o'clock ray flaw on the upper left corners, and also a 7 o'clock ray flaw similarly in both 1A and 1B. Although it should be noted that the absence of these doesn't necessarily preclude it from being plate 1, because there were repairs done over periods of time. But if it's got the ray flaw, then the likelihood is that it's from plate 1. It could also be from plate 2, which does show the ray flaw as well. But there are other differences, and plate 2 has several guidelines on it, which may give a clue to that one. Plate 3 can be recognised by a very thin baseline. On most of the other plates it's quite thick, whereas plate 3 is noticeably thinner. And as long as you've got one to compare it with, then you can have an idea that this is the one. Plate 4 apparently is covered in lots of spots. That sounds a very strange thing to say and an odd description, but when you look at the stamps, there's quite often black spots where white bits should be and white spots where black bits should be. Now, I'm not quite sure why this happened or how this happened, but again, it's a way of spotting that particular plate. Plate 5 has a weak margins, especially down the left-hand side. So if there's breaks in it or if it just doesn't look strong, then that's a possibility. Plate 6 is not a lot of distinguishing characteristics, so that's a difficult one, and one where you really need to look at the position of the check letters. Then with plate 7, 8, 9 and 10, there is what's called an O flaw, where the O from the word 1 in 1 penny has damage at the bottom, and in the bottom right corner of the O there's an extra lump of white, which gradually gets bigger as you go through the plates. Also with plate 7, some of the stamps are okay, but some of them have the O flaw. So as I said earlier, the presence of this is a good indication that it belongs to these plate numbers, but the absence of this doesn't necessarily mean it's not from these plate numbers. You just have to look at extra clues to help you. And finally with plate 11, only 700 sheets of plate 11 were printed, and this is by far the most valuable penny black that you'll find. most of the penny blacks catalogue at about £300 or £400 used, but the plate 11 you're looking at more like £4,000 or £5,000 used. So as you can see, it's if you can find a plate 11, then it's well worth all the expense and all the time and effort that you've put into plating them. One thing to look out for with plate 11 is the shade of colour is more of a grey tone than it is deep black. But there are similar shades on other plates, so again, just because it's grey doesn't mean it's necessarily for plate 11. It's also very unlikely you're going to find a plate 11 with a red Maltese cross, because they were phased out before plate 11 was put into print. But it's something to look out for, and as I said, look at these resources on the internet. If you can afford it, or if you can find it, then buy the book, The Plating of the Penny Black, and have fun. It does take a lot of effort, it does take a bit of time, and to a certain extent a bit of guesswork. But there's a lot of people on the internet that are prepared to confirm or not your guesses. It's unfair to just ask them to plate one for you. I think you should put some sort of effort into it and have a go yourself. And after all, that's the only way to learn. But it's a bit of fun and an enjoyable part of stamp collecting. So if this has inspired you to hunt down your different plate numbers of the penny black you've got, or the penny blacks you've got, then good luck, and I hope you find the elusive plate 11. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Don't forget you can visit my online stores at eBay and Delcampe under the name of Ourdadsstamps, where I have over 2,000 items for sale. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Ourdadsstamps podcast.